So I'm going to start by saying I'm basically a skeptic when it comes to the paranormal. Although I love hearing stories and listening to other points of view when it comes to that kind of stuff. This is why I'm having such a hard time understanding what happened to me last September. My dad, grandma, grandpa, and I were attending my cousin's wedding in a small rural town just outside of South Haven, Michigan, late last summer. We rented a small house in town, which was located in a very wooded area just off a small lake. Something felt extremely off as soon as I got out of the car at our rental property. That's the best way I could describe it. Something felt off, and I was immediately uneasy. But, being the skeptic that I am, I shrugged it off and chalked it up to being tired and anxious. The night we arrived, my dad and I were having a smoke outside and noticed how weird everything sounded. It was about 11 p.m. and there was no one else around. The trees were cracking incredibly loudly and we were hearing strange animal noises, but nothing too out of the ordinary. Just the type of animal noises you would hear in rural Michigan, but they just sounded particularly strange to us for some reason. We said our goodnights and went to bed. The next morning, my dad told me that he went outside for a smoke at about 2-ish that morning and heard what sounded to him like someone close by banging on metal siding. He said it sounded like it was just next door, but didn't hear anything leading up to or preceding the loud banging, like footsteps or anything like that. We shrugged and laughed it off. The second night was when I heard things that I still can't stop thinking about 6 months later. It was about 11 p.m. to midnight, and I was having my last smoke of the night. My grandparents were already asleep, and my dad had just gotten into bed, but still awake, watching TV. I was sitting on the stairs outside with my back to the house, looking straight out into the backyard. I heard someone shout my name in a very abrupt manner, loud and fast. It sounded like they were shouting towards me from the front of the house, like they were standing on the front porch, shouting for me, knowing I was at the back of the house. It sounded just like my dad, but it couldn't be him because I didn't hear the front door open or close or anything. Being a skeptic, I reminded myself to stay calm, and I quickly walked back into the house. My dad was sound asleep. There was no way that by the time I got to him, he could have gotten back into bed. I woke him up, and I asked him if he was outside screaming my name. He looked confused and said of course not. I started to get really freaked out at this point. I tried to go back to bed, but I couldn't get that scream out of my head. I was up all night trying to figure out what happened. I was honestly contemplating leaving, getting a hotel room somewhere close by, and returning in the morning. Miraculously, I must have fallen asleep sometime around 3 a.m. We woke up the next morning, and I was so ready to get the hell out of that town. As soon as we left, the uneasy feeling I had the entire weekend disappeared. When I returned to work the next day, I told my coworker the weird experience I had. Her face immediately dropped. She proceeded to inform me that this is quite common in the Appalachian area regarding cryptids and other types of creatures. Apparently they try to get your attention by mimicking someone close to you, and when you look at them, they kidnap you, or something along those lines. But I was in Michigan. I tried to look up the information about the town I was in, but I didn't find anything remotely interesting. Has anyone else had a similar experience? I'm not sure if this is the right place for this experience, but the post here jogged an old hidden memory from my childhood that I now need to get off my chest. In 1999, I was 7 years old, playing in the woods with my friend Charlotte. We were standing at the end of a big log in the woods when I noticed movement in my peripherals. I tried focusing my periphery to catch the detailed look. I see similar movement often when we're in the woods, and always disappears, more like scatters, before I turned to look. My heart skipped a beat when I could make out a group of little people looking up at me as well. I was frozen in the pose I was playing in. After a few seconds, I realized Charlotte had stopped narrating out play and was frozen in place as well, staring at me, but focusing on them. I'm pretty sure they were dressed, because it didn't look like they were all naked. I could tell they knew that we were aware of them, and they dispersed as Charlotte moved her eyes. We didn't talk about it until we were in her house. We weren't afraid, just confused on our walk home. We wrote out what we saw before talking about it to see if we saw the same thing. Unfortunately, both of our descriptions were so vague, but clothed, less than a foot for sure. One thing we were positive of was to mind our business and not go searching, which is what our instincts would have usually been. Duh. We thought we found a colony of little people in the woods, but the fact that our reaction was to quietly leave and not even talk about it until behind closed doors, and still not even talk out loud, but write it. I don't remember being too frightened. In fact, we kind of just accepted it and moved on with a new taste of what this world and universe is capable of. I watched The Indian in the Cupboard later in life, which reminded me of these little people, but I no longer saw them by then. Charlotte and I would talk about seeing things out of the corner of our eyes, but could never figure out what it was. Although Charlotte was different, her and her dad were huge hippies, tire swing in the kitchen, no TV, and her imagination was so wildly magnificent that it made my mind radiate. I always thought that maybe her narration of our play was so powerful and energetic that we could manifest and see the same thing. Little people were never playing any parts in either of our imaginations. In fact, when we both confirmed what each other saw, we were kind of in awe that we never even dreamt of tiny people on this universe. Back when I was a security guard, I used to work the graveyard shift. It was a crap assignment that had me driving 30 minutes both ways for 10 an hour, so I didn't stick around long. Anyways, at this time of night, there would rarely be anyone else there. Sometimes a worker or two would come back around midnight with a rental car after having been on some business trip, and they'd give me the keys before taking their own car home. Most of the time, though, I was completely alone in a big facility with a connected, abandoned office. The office was pretty chilling to walk through, but in my last weeks working there, I never had any issues in there. There was a bunch of construction going on in the middle of the building, though, a few hundred yards from the security office, and I often had to go into this giant concrete room to check on a water leak that had started. I didn't think anything of it, and was glad for the chance to get out of the office beyond my usual patrols. I checked this room during my patrols as well, and one time, after I'd passed through that room and started walking down the hall, I could have sworn I heard a blood-curdling scream some ways down the hall behind me. I turned on my heels and grabbed my radio. We carried one with us and left one at the main entrance for anyone to use if they had to call us over. I called out over the radio for anyone who just entered the building to pick up the radio and talk to me right away. I repeated this a few times, walking down the hall and swinging my light around. I didn't hear the noise again, and no one answered me, so I wrapped up that patrol and went back to the security office. I checked the cameras, and sure enough, no one had entered while I'd been walking around. This happened to me a few times during my last shifts, and it always unsettled me. So I was much happier taking the upstairs patrol route, because even though the upstairs and penthouse were creepier, I'd never heard what I thought to be a ghost lady screaming up there. I didn't interact with the company that used the building much, besides sending them emails about patrol findings, but I decided to reach out to one of the guys who actually liked us lowly security guards and asked him if he knew anything. I thought I would sound crazy to him, but when I described the sound and where it was in the hallway beside the room with the leaking pipe, he told me that people heard it during the day as well. It turned out to be just some water from elsewhere in the building that was being diverted to the pipes in the hallway, because that's what had been causing the leak in the concrete room. I never got an explanation about the scream I heard in the cordoned-off room directly behind the security office one night, but I left for a better-paying job before I cared to go down that rabbit hole. From what the security supervisor told me when we were discussing the construction before this all happened, he told me that it used to be an infirmary, mostly for employees who had been exposed to radiation, actually a viable occupational risk there. I don't think I heard some radioactive zombie. I just never figured out what that noise could have been. Hello everyone. I work out in the country and take back roads for the last half of my trip to work. The road I was on is about 3 to 4 miles long. My experience occurred within a distance of 1,000-ish feet on that road before ending. It was still dark at the time, 6:20 something. My car came with very bright LED headlights and fog lights, and I can see very well in the darkness, as I was driving with all lights on, and I didn't want to hit a deer. On the right side of the road, just a couple hundred feet in front of my car, I saw what looked like a human made out of black mist, but it was dark, so I assumed it was someone just dressed in black. I hit my brakes to make sure I drove by them safely, but as I hit my brakes, the entity disappeared and appeared a couple hundred to a few hundred feet away on the right side again. This is when I know that I was experiencing something paranormal or non-human. I almost got to it before it disappeared again. It appeared a few hundred feet away on the left side of the road. That was the last I saw of it. The best visible description I can give it is a human that is completely black, like a void, with a slight to medium haziness and cloudiness around it. I have had paranormal and other supernatural experiences at my home out in the country and throughout my life. This one did not spook me, but I have never experienced something like this, aside from seeing shadow figures in my home that my family members have also admitted to seeing frequently and in a consistent place in our home. They normally disappear into a doorway as if a spirit is just lurking around and then making their escape from view. Has anyone experienced something similar? Are there widespread sightings like this? Is there a general consensus of what this entity or being is? Thank you in advance for reading and for your potential advice or information.